Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, let's get into it. Here's what's coming up tonight. Labor is fracturing under the pressure of its pro-Palestine lobby. So will we see more tributes for Palestine being made across the country, including on our own Sydney Opera House? Jenna Clark and Matt Canavan will join me to discuss. Plus, state governments are wondering how they can push ahead with their own voices and treaties if their residents all voted no last weekend. Bronwyn Bishop and Jason Morrison are on my panel tonight. We'll look at what truth-telling and treaty processes are underway in your state. And Joe Biden is in Israel, begging the Israelis to be less angry and do more to help get aid into Gaza. But is his message of support too weak for the Jewish people? Kosher Garda will join me later. Well, the Prime Minister is under significant pressure today to maintain unity as his government fractures over the Israel-Hamas conflict. Albanese has expressed his support for Israel on multiple occasions, including at a synagogue last week, where he claimed to speak on behalf of the government.
The government and the people of Australia unequivocally condemn the attack by Hamas. The targeting of civilians and the taking of hostages is an affront to all Australians, and we condemn these horrific acts.
But this week we've seen a string of Labor MPs express their support for Palestine. Frontbencher Anne Ali called for Israel to be investigated for war crimes.
No food, no energy, no way out. It is hard to argue that it is not a form of collective punishment.
Another Labor MP, Maria Van Vakunu, attended a pro-Palestine rally and labelled Israel's retaliation an invasion.
The people of Gaza cannot be collateral damage. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. But there is no justification whatsoever under any rules of war or anything that will allow a civilian population to square off against an army.
So IDF is a terrorist organisation as well?
It is an army.
Fatima Payman, a Labor senator, also had this to say in Parliament the other day.
The international community loudly and proudly condemned Russia's occupation of Ukraine when it started attacking Ukraine in 2014. Yet today, the world watches as the State of Israel deprives the entire population, men, women and children, of the basic necessities of life: food, water, electricity, gas and medicines. We must condemn it.
And then we have the latest development, a comment from Ed Husic today. He's the Minister for Industry and Science and a Muslim himself. Here he was on ABC Radio National.
The number of Palestinians that have been killed so far equates to the number of people who lost their lives in 9/11. We don't see any public landmarks in Australia that are being lit up in red, black, white and green. I feel very strongly that Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas's barbarism.
In response to that, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill has today attempted to distance herself from her colleague's remarks, insisting, quote unquote, Israel does have a right to defend itself. But Albanese faces within his party a common problem across the Western left, a tendency to decry and alienate our allies to our own detriment. It's like when we saw people at Sydney University last week brandishing a sign saying queers for Palestine. The reality is that queer people, and many other people in the West for that matter, wouldn't last 5 minutes in Palestine. It's said that turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but in this discussion, many seem to do so. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's not only one of the most socially liberal nations in the Middle East, but in the world. It's often ranked as one of the safest and most accepting places on earth for gay people, a nation in the Middle East. Now, while there's little likelihood any of this would change the government's official view, and nor should it, it sends a message to the Middle East that there is disquiet among the ranks. Using our parliament, our house of democracy, to weigh in against our ally is misguided at best and dangerous at worst. This is war. I mean, no one wants to see innocent civilians killed, but that is the unfortunate reality of war. Do not forget that this latest outbreak of fighting was caused by Hamas launching an attack on innocent people at a music festival, flying in on gliders and then entering communities to indiscriminately kill people, including women and children. The left often engages in Western self-loathing. Despite enjoying all the spoils and traps of living in a comfortable and safe part of the world that exists because of democracy and the rule of law, they support people in countries and organisations that would seek to destroy that. They do so because they take issue with the colonial past of the West. They somehow, perversely, see us as irredeemable wrongdoers and those who would seek to wipe us off the planet as somehow virtuous. Again, these people would not last 5 minutes under the rule of an outfit like Hamas or in any other Muslim nations they so often defend. Husic and co propose that Israel should not be allowed to defend itself. Should it stand by and watch its people, the Jewish people, one of the most oppressed peoples in living memory, to be killed in the single biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust and do nothing? To light up the Sydney Opera House or any other building in the country in the colours of the Palestinian flag, although perhaps well-meaning and a heartfelt message to innocent civilians who have died, would send a message that Australia stands with Palestine. We cannot do that. Now, there are, of course, religious and deep historical motivations for this war on both sides. But for us as Australia, and likewise the US, that's why Joe Biden is over in Israel at the moment, we must always stand with democracy. We should be even more serious about standing with democracy in our home of democracy, Parliament House. At the very least, the Prime Minister needs to counsel his members and ministers over their comments. The government needs to present a united front. It's this kind of disunity that allows anti-Semitism to breed. We saw it on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne last week. There are legitimate discussions to be had about the cost of war, but Australia has a very clear ally here, and it isn't Hamas. Now is not the time to buy into arguments that undermine our ultimate goals, however well-meaning they may be. Well, let's bring in the Associate Editor of The Australian, Jenna Clark, now to talk all the stories of the day. Jenna, welcome. The Premier of New South Wales, as I was just talking about, he's rejected calls for the Opera House to be lit up in the colours of the Palestinian flag. You had the founder of a popular restaurant chain, Rashay's, today, Rami Kamoor, pleading for the government to make the tribute, to pay respect to the 471 lives lost, or that's at least what has been estimated, in the Gaza hospital blast. But can you imagine if we were to do that? It would be very mixed signals, given that we've already lit up the Opera House in the colours of the Israeli flag.
Oh, absolutely, Caleb. And I think the sooner that the Premier, Chris Minns, can move away from this issue as a state political hot potato, the better for him. I think you're right. We don't really want to see the Palestinian flag be on the sails of the Sydney Opera House just at this point in time, considering the volatile nature of where this conflict is at right now. And also, I think it just goes to show that rather than the deep divide within the Australian community, I think the deeper divide is within the Labor Party, as we've seen today.
Indeed, and that's the trouble for the Prime Minister here, and of course you can see it in state MPs as well, is that we as a country, particularly when you're a member of the government, have to stand with the only democracy in the Middle East, which is Israel. I mean, if a mainstream left-wing party like the ALP or the Democrats in the US were to at this point roll over and say, well, we stand with Palestine, I mean, that would be the end of that party. You simply can't do it. You can't stand up against democracy, because even if you have issues with Israel, and it is legitimate to have issues with Israel, if you lose democracy, a foothold on democracy in the Middle East, then we as the West are weakened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest issue is, I think that, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a lot of issues going on within the Israeli government before this terrorist attack took place. But I think the interesting thing is take your cues from what we're seeing in Israel at this point in time, and just the people that even want to leave Australia to go and be reservists now with the IDF. Put those thoughts aside, and we'll deal with them when it is possible to do so, because there is a much bigger issue here, and it's an attack on democracy, and it's not just in Israel and in Gaza and in Palestine at this point in time. We're seeing that Palestinian child that was killed in Chicago just a couple of days ago. It is happening all around the world.
Indeed. Now, Lisa Wilkinson, we learned today, is suing Channel 10 for not paying her $370,000 legal bill for the Bruce Lerman defamation suit. So the former project presenter sought her own legal team, not the one that the network has on retainer, to defend herself against Lerman, who, of course, has been suing over her 2021 interview with Brittany Higgins. And we know in that interview that Higgins alleged she was raped by a colleague, which was identifiable as Lerman, and Lerman has always maintained his innocence. But it's just another step in this very sorry saga.
This is, I hate to say, as a media reporter, this is the gift that keeps on giving. It is not. I cannot keep up with the amount of legal fees and legal cases that are going on, adjacent and also at the central crux of this issue as well, Caleb. This today, on top of Ms Wilkinson deciding to pursue her legal costs, good on her, I think. The fact that she was completely thrown under the bus by Network 10, I think, and especially the ACT former DPP as well, as we heard in those other cases beforehand as well. So, look, I hate to say that this has got a long way to run, but I think it's definitely got a long way to run still.
Yeah, and the worst part of all of this, I don't think there's been any winners in this story anywhere, whether it was Brittany Higgins or Bruce Lerman or Lisa Wilkinson. I think everyone's come out pretty scathed by all of this.
Indeed, absolutely.
Well, Australia's unemployment rate fell again to 3.6% in October. Now, Treasurer Jim Chalmers said that this fall in unemployment was welcome. Take a look.
Unemployment, despite all of our economic challenges, is lower now than when we came to office. It has averaged 3.6% under us compared to 5.6% under our predecessors. So this is a really welcome result.
Now, it's all good and well for the Treasurer to stand there and say, this is a welcome result, unemployment is down, but we all know the subtext. That is the danger, is that this opens us up to another interest rate rise on Melbourne Cup Day.
Yeah, absolutely. And then potentially another one but just before Christmas in December as well, Caleb. So, yeah, I think it's all well and good. Look, the government at this point in time probably need all the good news that they can get. And if it is just, 0.1%, then they'll take that. But I think, like we're hearing from all of the economists today, Ross Greenwood just previously saying, we're right to be on shaky ground, because this probably means a pretty hairy end of the year for Australians that are already doing it tough out there with cost of living.
I'm just going to throw an idea out there. I reckon, given what a lot of economists have been saying, which is that, we'll have one or two interest rate rises before the end of the year, then we'll probably stagnate until at least mid next year, so perhaps 6-8 months of stable interest rates, and then they will start to come down. If the government's got some smarts, by that time they'll be able to call an election. So do you go to an early election as interest rates start coming down and say, well, look, we did the hard yards, we got through the hard times, we've actually done a decent job of cleaning up the economy?
Yeah, look, it is the economy, stupid. They're not saying that to you, Caleb, but I think when it comes down to it, that's probably something that the Treasurer, who, regardless of what he does protest too much, I must say, has ambitions for higher office. It will put him in very good stead for a potential leadership tilt later down the track. But also, and I know that you have spoken about this very much on the late debate for the past couple of months, if they do decide to go to an early election, they could escape any sort of definitive decision on the stage 3 tax cuts coming down the pipe back as well. So you may be on the money there.
Yes, but you know it's all going to be cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. The voice to Parliament's out of the way now. I know.
Yeah, exactly. About time.
It's taken a while, but they've got to get down to brass tacks. Speaking of getting down to brass tacks, Queensland councils have banded together to fight the youth crime epidemic, and you know I just beggars belief that we're still talking about this. We've been talking about this on Sky for years now, and they've slammed the state government's response so far as utterly useless, quote unquote. I don't think you could disagree with that. The Local Government Association of Queensland have put forward a 9-point proposal recommending an audit of all existing youth justice programs and an increase in the number of Indigenous police officers. I mean, at this point, a 9-point proposal is great, but, you know, for heaven's sake, nothing they've done to this point has worked. We've got to the point where Queensland now is turning watch houses into you know, youth detention because they've run out of places to put these people. Where does the Queensland government get off here?
Hopefully out of government when they next go to a state election, because I think if the opposition, and David Christodoulou will be very good at running these type of lines, they've been focusing really hard on showing, you know, what is happening at a grassroots level when it comes to youth crime all around Queensland. But at the end of the day, if your local government is having to combat things like youth crime, and that's what your rates are paying for, which is what your taxes should be paying for, then I think the people of Queensland are right to be asking questions of just what is the state government doing about this absolute epidemic.
Yep, and it's been going on for a very long time, and I think Christofouli's been quite effective of late, and as a former journo, he knows how to sell that media message, which will be all important leading up to the state election. Now, New South Wales live music and concert venues are soon going to be allowed to open later and avoid noise complaints from neighbours under sweeping new reforms that are going to kick off at the start of summer. So opening times will be extended by 2 hours, and it will now take 5 individual noise complaints to warrant a licence review. Hooray! I mean, I remember a few months ago sitting here talking about a couple of stories. I think one was at the Mossman Bowls Club, where on a Sunday they had started having a live band, and you know the kids were allowed to run around on the bowling green, and the local residents kicked up a stink and said, "You can't do that, it's too much noise, we don't want it." So the Bowls Club turned around and said, "Oh, well, we've had a proposal from an aged care outfit that want to put up like a 10-storey building here and put the Bowls Club on the top and a nursing home in the middle of it, and it'll block out your waterfront views. How about that?"
Look, I think it really will be the summer of the NIMBY, and not only in New South Wales, but I think all around the country, because this will be really interesting, and I just cannot wait to see the Facebook groups fire up about this, especially, Caleb, and I'm sorry to say it to those in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, I think it's going to be delicious to see some of the absolute fraught, clutching of pearls comments are being punched out here. But then on the other side of it, on the other side of the country in Western Australia, to really get things started when it comes to allowing houses and new houses to be built. The state government have come in just overnight and said, you know, we're going to make sure that local government don't have any say now on approval procedures. And you could, if you did hear that shrill at around 9:05 last night, that was definitely a whole pack of NIMBYs in the western suburbs of Perth just absolutely losing their minds. It is going to be an interesting time in the lead up to Christmas.
It will indeed. I've got to say, though, I do have a small issue with the idea of councils being excluded entirely, because as much as I agree, like, we need more housing, the danger, I think, in allowing state governments or you know, regulatory bodies set up by state governments to take total control of planning is that they don't look at character and they don't look at heritage. And so you lose the possibility of that happy medium. Like, councils go too far very often, and so do state governments.
Yes.
So how can we find that happy medium where you can keep the character and you can keep the heritage, but where it is right to do so, increase the density?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. But I think on top of that question, I would also put you, how do we also maintain transparency also as well to make sure that developers don't just sort of come in, flood the government with maybe, I don't want to say largesse, but, you know, treat them with some financial attention, just if they have a particular project that they would like to see a green lit, because we know councils, like you say, councils can be pretty tricky at times because, again, I think people are very passionate about their backyard, and I think you're going to see that really play out not only in the media but at local council meetings over the next couple of months. It's going to be really interesting. Oh,
Jenna, don't make the suggestion of developers and brown paper bags. We know what that did to the New South Wales Labor government a few years ago, don't we? Jenna Clark, thank you for your time tonight. Coming up, the US has vetoed a United Nations motion in a clear sign of solidarity with Israel. But will it affect the president's success in the Middle East? Kosha Garda, joins me after this. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, Egypt is allowing 20 trucks carrying aid to travel into Gaza as the World Health Organisation says conditions for trapped civilians are quickly spiralling out of control. The US President arrived in Israel yesterday and concurs with the Israeli Defence Force that Wednesday's Gaza hospital blast was indeed the result of misfired rockets from Islamic jihadis.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
Since his Arab Leaders Summit was cancelled, Biden has been meeting with Israeli officials to discuss ways to facilitate humanitarian aid into Gaza, urging them not to respond to Hamas's attack with too much anger.
I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership. There's always cost.
Israel has so far agreed to help facilitate aid, but will not allow any supplies to enter Gaza from its own territory until Hamas releases all hostages. Then meanwhile, at the United Nations, US representatives vetoed a motion from the Security Council that called for humanitarian pauses in the conflict to help get aid into Gaza. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda joins me now. Kosha, welcome. The Israeli Prime Minister met with the US President Joe Biden yesterday.
Yes, he did. And, you know, I think this is a really tough moment for President Biden and really all world leaders that are coming in there, because they always have to speak to multiple audiences at once. And so in that moment, he's speaking to the Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. He's speaking to other allies. He's speaking to adversaries, China, Russia. Others are watching how the U.S. is maneuvering itself in these times. He's obviously speaking domestically, where we've got a very divided country, and in his own Democrat Party, there's a big faction of people that, you know, hold a different view and are not all aligned on standing with Israel or how much should be done with Israel. So he's really walking a tightrope, as any U.S. leader would, and I think especially Biden, where the complexities of that multifaceted audience, you know, maybe something that's a little bit tough for him to navigate. But I think those comments at least were on message, and he overall, you know, did a fine job, I think.
Indeed, and I talked about this in my editorial at the top of the show, you know, a similar thing here in Australia, where you've got Labor MPs and ministers like Ed Husic now starting to speak out and perhaps go against the grain on what is our official stance on Israel. How much of a risk is it to Biden and the US when you have people like AOC breaking the party line on what is fundamentally an issue of a fight between democracy and terrorists?
I think it's a really, really tall order for him and really for any U.S. president. You saw just images today where there were people, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel protests flooding the Capitol, which, you know, the irony of that wasn't lost on many people given what's happened in recent times with people who flooded the Capitol in protest. You've seen rallies all across the U.S. and all around the world, and a lot of them do align more so with the left wing or the left-leaning parties, a Democrat in this case. And so that is going to be very difficult for him to kind of walk that line and negotiate and find that balancing act to give them a little something, but then also stand with the principles on the other side of both the old guard, more traditional moderate Democrats, as well as, of course, a general election coming up where he's going to have to appeal to the broader swath of the U.S. electorate. It's really tricky, Caleb, and I think in an increasingly fragmented and divided society, it's that pathway gets narrower and narrower, and there may come a point where it's almost impossible to walk. But I think for now, there's just really narrow room, and as long as he stays on that tightrope, he might be able to just get through this one.
Well, we have news in just now that the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has just landed in Israel to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu. You've sort of had all the big players from our allies go there now. Is there any chance that we will send someone, or even the Prime Minister, do you think?
Potentially, I think the momentum or even the expectation is certainly mounting for world leaders to come together really for the cause of de-escalation, first and foremost, because the temperature is really heating up in the world, certainly here since what happened 10 days ago. And those were atrocious things. Nobody is denying that. But it's very quickly in the fog of war, it's possible for things to just sort of spiral a little bit out of control. And so I think that there's unanimous agreement that we want to de-escalate as much as possible. And if that means more leaders showing up there to try and bring the temperature down, that's a good thing. I think the other part is standing with our close allies and standing against the barbarism that we saw, and for the principles of Israel kind of defending its own rights and fighting for its own sovereignty. I think that's another message that you see in this. But I think in all countries, Caleb, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK with Prime Minister Sunak there, or whether if we go as well, just as the countries are getting more and more fragmented, where there's just more and more groups of people, because of a consequence, I think, of just the immigration experiment, frankly, that's taken place in the Western world over the last 50 years. You just do have to see this balance where people are navigating a very divided electorate, and it's very tricky, I think, for world leaders to show up there and say the right thing that resonates with all audiences.
Now let's talk about the cluster, and you can finish that word, that is the election of a new House Speaker over in the US. The Republican Party is still struggling to elect a Speaker, with the nominee Jim Jordan missing out again on the second ballot. So the House has now been without a Speaker for 2 weeks, which means in that time they've not been able to pass any bills, including ones, of course, that would give aid to Israel and Ukraine. How are they ever going to solve this?
Yes, I think the theme of this segment, the previous topic and this one, is this fragmentation, that word that I keep using, that's taking place everywhere. Even in the Republican Party, there's a long brewing civil war, really. It's more than fragmentation within the Republican Party. And it actually goes way back. People think about it right now in recent events and the effect maybe Trump had, or Matt Gaetz, who's sort of a populist, or he represents that Trump wing of the party. It goes way back to 2008 with the Tea Party. Then you had in 2014 Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader. He was primaried, which has never happened in the history of the Republic, and that was a shocking result. Then you had people like John Boehner and Paul Ryan, who basically resigned or decided not to run for re-election because they knew they didn't have the support. And all of those things build up to this moment that we're in now, where you've got the civil war, and there's one faction of the Republican Party really consolidated, I think, and sharpened with the election of Trump in 2016, even though he lost in 2020, where they're just not happy with the way Republicans are running Congress. And they have enough of a majority that they can really flex their muscle here, even if it's ugly, even if it's a cluster. As you said, they're just like, this is our moment to push this. We don't want unlimited funding. We don't want the open border. And so we're going to do what we can in the limited leverage that we have to really push that to a hilt. And I think that's what you're seeing, the sentiment among the Republican base, certainly, which is leading to this very fascinating and, yes, very messy dynamic that's taking place in the US Congress.
Well, hey, we've still got the idea in the background. We could always make Donald Trump the Speaker of the House, because there's no rule saying that they have to be sitting in the House, do they?
There is no rule. I think we talked about that before, and think about how that would go down. I don't think there's any realistic chance that would happen. They're not even getting behind someone like Jim Jordan, as an example. Yeah. Let alone somebody a little bit more extreme like that. But it's crazy. I think McCarthy took multiple votes. This will happen again.
Just think of the entertainment. How good would it be? Kosher Garda, thank you for your time. Well, still to come, Labor states are wrestling with their overwhelming no votes as they ponder whether to push ahead with their treaty processes. Bronwyn Bishop and Jason Morrison will join me after this. Don't go away. Welcome back, I'm Caleb Bond in for Sharri Markson. Well, if you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to be across tonight. The Sydney Opera House will not be lit up in support of Palestine, says New South Wales Premier Chris Minns, as Labor ministers call for more help for the Palestinian people. The unemployment rate has fallen again to 3.6%, increasing the chances of a rate hike in November by the Reserve Bank. Lisa Wilkinson is suing Channel 10 for not paying her $370,000 legal bill as she fights Bruce Lerman's defamation lawsuit. The Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, has just landed in Tel Aviv to continue pushing Israel to facilitate aid into Gaza, as US President Joe Biden announces aid could arrive as soon as Friday through Egypt. And dessert company Sara Lee, famous of course for its frozen cheesecakes and pies, has gone into voluntary administration after more than 50 years of operation in Australia. By the way, we were meant to be joined by the Australian's Yoni Bashan a short time ago. He's in Tel Aviv at the moment, but he couldn't join us due to having to move out. He's being evacuated. So if we get any more information on that, we will let you know. Well, as I just said, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has just landed in Israel to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Israeli Prime Minister met with US President Joe Biden yesterday. As for our own Prime Minister, he too is jetting off this week to the US. Opposition leader Peter Dutton insists Albanese must stop via Tel Aviv.
I think it would also be in our country's best interest, Prime Minister, to go via Tel Aviv and provide support to the Israeli leadership. It is important for us to be able to stand with Israel at this time, as other world leaders have done. That should be the priority, frankly, of any international travel at the moment, so that we can seek to be part of an alliance to keep the pressure down on those who seek to have a wider conflict in the region.
Well, let's bring in my panel for this evening, commentator Jason Morrison and former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop. Bronwyn, you've been there and done that in Parliament. If this was a government you were in, would you be expecting the Prime Minister to be on a plane to Tel Aviv tomorrow?
Yes.
Simple as that?
Yes, I would, because he'll take a plane to anywhere.
Well, Airbus Albo, they were calling him for a while.
Absolutely, and he seriously will. And he's going off to have a dinner party, seriously. At a time like this, when we've got riots on the streets of Sydney, which is a spillover from what's happening there, this would show leadership that he means it when he said he's backing Israel and its right to defend itself. But, oh no, he'll just chuff off and go to dinner and be out of the country. Cancels Parliament, by the way, to do it. I mean, seriously, what sort of a leader is this man? He cannot even take responsibility for the failure of his own referendum when it was his hubris that put it forward in the way it was.
I mean, it's a pretty good lark. I mean, Jason, I hate to say it, but Joe Biden has actually been stronger on all of this than our own Prime Minister.
Even call that Joe Biden's strength?
Well, look, no, his comments,
old fool.
His comments last week were strong. What he did yesterday, I thought was a bit ordinary, but at least he's shown up.
Can I say I disagree with Bronwyn on this? I actually don't think the Australian Prime Minister needs to go, nor should go, to Tel Aviv. One reason, principal reason, the risk. We don't need another international target wandering into the middle of a hotspot. But let's add on to it. His problems are here. Our problems are here. If you want to look at the peace and harmony of Australia, stay here. Well, that's where we need him at the moment.
No, if he goes, he's showing he means it. He's already got his cabinet breaking up.
Well, you know the answer. He doesn't mean it. He doesn't mean. He's a buck each way on this.
Well, he's a buck each way. We know that. We know that anti-Semitism is ingrained into the left of politics, into the socialist ethos.
I think he's a phony if he goes. He's a phony because he doesn't mean it.
But he has come out and said that this is Australia's position, and to prove it, he should go. If Sunak can go, then he can go.
But what's gained out of going? What's gained out of sending the RAAF in, getting the bloke out there, having to have the SAS follow him around for an hour whilst he shakes hands, gets some photos?
Because he's actually showing that this is what Australia his position is.
I have a
At
feeling.
the moment, he's not even taking on.
I have a feeling
his own minister.
that Israel knows what Australia's view on it, despite what the Prime Minister is saying.
We need Australians to know.
Well,
because they don't know at the moment. You've got Ed Husick going off there making his two
But that's not going to stop.
But he does need to intervene on
He does.
That's right. This is not going to stop. You're not going to stop that. You're not going to stop the fruitcakes and the left of the Labor Party.
No, but it shows at the moment he's not seen to be in control.
But it's bullshit. He doesn't mean it.
He
doesn't mean it. He does.
But he's in a position where Australia does, and he's got to be seen to be giving that leadership.
Well, yeah, I mean,
the man is a fool. I know that.
It's cosmetic. It's cosmetic.
I've told you before, I sat in that chamber with that man for 20 years and nobody ever said he was leadership material. Well, and we're just seeing right now why.
And now he's there, and how lucky are we? Speaking of leadership, obviously we saw over the weekend the voice to Parliament went down, but you've got the states have got their own plans. New South Wales isn't ruling out its own voice to Parliament, even though there was obviously a clear no vote in New South Wales. You've got the LNP in Queensland now is starting to backtrack on its support for a path to treaty.
It has backtracked.
They're obviously reading the room. Then down in Victoria, you've got John Pursuto saying it's too soon to commit to treaty down there. So again, they're starting to read the room.
They haven't done the grid over the top of the electoral results yet and gone, no. That's what's going to change minds here. Everyone wants to gesture at the moment that they are kind of interested in this because it feels like a good thing to do when you're on the left of politics, to sort of say we're going to defy this because we know what's right. But eventually, as they are in Queensland because they have an election coming right up behind them, they're looking at the grid and they're looking at where voted no and which seats we've got to hold, and they're just going to say forget this. They're not going to pursue it.
Well, the one that gets me, Bronwyn, is South Australia, because they're the only state so far that has legislated a voice to Parliament, and they're going to have elections on the membership in March next year. And the Premier, Peter Malinauskas, and the Attorney-General, Kaya Ma, have both said this is completely different to the federal voice to Parliament. We're going ahead with it anyway. Well, South Australia had the second highest no vote in the country, and I would contend that part of that is because they've already legislated one themselves. I mean, surely if you cared about the will of the people, you'd heed that, wouldn't you?
Yes, of course you would. Of course you would. And the backtracking that's going on now, and Malinauskas, of course, backtracked himself. He was supposed to have it all in place before the referendum.
Yes,
and suddenly,
and then they changed that.
It'll be 2024 or maybe 2028, I don't know. But the people have made it very clear. And they have made it clear that it is no to the Makarrata, which doesn't mean coming together, it means agreement making, and also to treaty. And it's quite plain, you know, this is the 26 pages, and if you go to the section on treaty...
You're telling me it's not one page, Bronwyn?
Absolutely.
You've read it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hang on, the PM didn't read it, Bronwyn has.
Absolutely. Look, treaty, it says here, and then it says treaty would be the vehicle to achieve self-determination, autonomy and self-government. And then it says, a treaty could include a proper say in decision-making, the establishment of a truth commission, reparations, a financial settlement such as seeking a percentage of GDP, the resolution of land, water and resource issues, recognition of authority and customary law. And the constitutional amendment could be the negotiating framework to give constitutional status to any concluded treaty. No state can do that.
No wonder the Prime Minister didn't want to read it.
Exactly.
I noticed you got the autographed edition too. How can you have a treaty
with yourself?
With yourself,
correct.
I mean, it's the bit that's
we're a bit far gone for that.
Perhaps I'm simple.
I think. Now, the Premier of New South Wales has, of course, rejected today calls for the Opera House to be lit up in the colours of the Palestinian flag, despite the founder of this popular restaurant, Rashay's plea. We'll take a look at that.
Is our government going to step up the same way they did for what happened last Sunday? Are they going to illuminate the green, the white and the black and the red on our Opera House and on other iconic buildings around Australia?
And then you had the Director General of Security at our top intelligence organisation saying that the threats to the nation's safety are heightened from extremists who've been sort of aggravated by this war in the Middle East. You had Mike Burgess saying that neo-Nazis could be firing up at the anti-Semitic nature of the conflict, spurring them to turn violent. Then on the other side, the ASIO boss said the Muslim population could be seeing their oppression as an opportunity for violence, both of which he says they're keeping an eye on. But I think all of this kicked off when we didn't shut down that protest at the Opera House last Monday. We sent a message that saying things like gas the Jews is okay, and it's on for young and old after that.
But two things to say about that. I'm amazed at all the statements the head of ASIO makes these days. We never heard from him before. His job is to advise government. Government makes announcements, not him. Secondly, with regard to this cry of river to the ocean, is to say eliminate the Jews.
Correct.
And those demonstrations were saying gas them. In other words, they were saying finish Hitler's work. Now, not many people realise that after World War II, 6,000 of Hitler's top people went to Egypt to advise Nasser. It's no accident that Eichmann was arrested in Egypt, because that's where he was doing his job. You can go through them, and the people who were there, like the doctor who ran the concentration camp of Mauthausen, whose party trick I won't describe here, it is too revolting. But it is that influence carried through into the Middle East from the post-World War II period. Now, when you've got cries to gas the Jews, kill the Jews from the river to the sea, they mean kill another 7 million people. That is what they are crying for. And this man wants to light up the Palestinian colours in Australia? I think not. And that's why Albanese has to go to Israel.
It's one thing, Jason, to talk about innocent civilians, and of course there are innocent Palestinians who get caught up in war, just as there are innocent Israelis who get caught up in war. But you cannot be seen to be supporting a country like Israel when we know what we're talking about is a war with a terrorist organisation.
That's right.
Yeah, look, I look at this and the ASIO warnings and even Mr Rachet's kind of statement, and I look at this and I just say, how wonderfully has the big multicultural dream turned out in Australia, where we have people who want to drag, up the ugly, horrible prejudices from all different pockets of the world to which they apparently left to come to a greater nation, and then want to rev them all up when the time's right. ASIO is in fear of all of this because, unfortunately, the political class in Australia kind of still want to entertain this sort of myth that we can have all of this and pretend that it's okay for people to kind of live in these little enclaves in society within our communities. And then every now and then when the big international affairs rev up, they suddenly become, in this case, Palestinian again. They're not Australian, if they ever were, or indeed whatever. It's frightful stuff, and it goes to the heart of Australia's inability to actually assimilate communities and take them on a journey towards being Australian. You look at what's going on in our cities, and particularly places like Sydney and Melbourne at the moment, where it can be in some pockets frightful and quite violent to think that we have really screwed this up.
And I think it's even more concerning when, as you often do, you end up with the second and third generations getting radicalised on this stuff.
Who often have nothing more than what they see on CNN and Twitter to connect them to it.
It beggars belief. Jason Morrison, Bronwyn Bishop, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Well, still to come, Labor's cracking under the pressure from its pro-Palestine faction, as we've just talked about. Matt Canavan will join me to discuss whether the Prime Minister can keep his divided party together after this. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, the Prime Minister, as we've been talking about tonight, is under significant pressure to maintain unity as his government fractures over the Israel-Palestine conflict. Albanese has expressed his support on multiple occasions, including at that synagogue last week, where he claimed to speak on behalf of the government. But, as we talked about earlier, there's been a string of Labor MPs express their support for Palestine.
I feel very strongly that Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas's barbarism.
The idea of war crimes is something that needs to be investigated. I would be loath to claim war crimes without a full investigation. That is how international law operates.
As the State of Israel deprives the entire population, men, women and children, of the basic necessities of life, food, water, electricity, gas and medicines. We must condemn it.
There is no justification whatsoever under any rules of war or anything that will allow a civilian population to square off against an army.
So IDF is a terrorist organisation as well?
It is an army. Can I just say that we stand with the people of Gaza.
Let's bring in National Senator for Queensland, Matt Canavan. Matt, it's pretty risky, isn't it, to see this kind of division in the government's ranks at a time of global upheaval?
Well, Caleb, I first, though, want to just put the emphasis here on the suffering that's occurring in the Middle East. That's got to be front and centre in any discussion. It's just been a harrowing couple of weeks for the world, and there's no doubt there's innocent people suffering on all sides here. I also think that, number two, I don't have any problem in a democratic nation with different members of parliament expressing different views on issues. And I don't think the statements of any of the politicians here in Canberra is going to have a material impact on Israel's ability to defend itself and or what is actually happening on the ground there in the Middle East. I also think, look, overall, the Prime Minister, as you've said up front, has said the right things. I think he had a bit of a stumbling response last week while he was distracted.
It took him a while
with the voice, but this week, he's found his straps. I think it was a very good motion that was supported by almost all here in the Parliament. And all I'd ask is for, especially the Labor ministers, is they be very careful with what they say to support the Prime Minister's mission now. He's going to the United States next week. I think we need the government, the executive government, those ministers in those government do need to try and present a united front as much as possible. And what we really should be focused on, I think, from our country's perspective, is avoiding a broader war here. There's no doubt that Israel has to respond to these barbaric attacks. There's no doubt then that response will, unfortunately, lead to more suffering, including of innocent lives. The blame for that is should be sheeted home to Hamas, who started all this. But of course, there's now also bigger risks of this blowing out into a broader conflict, which would be terrible for the whole world. So I do wish the Prime Minister all the best in the US next week, because I think all Australians, we're a peaceful nation. We want to see peace maintained as much as possible.
Well, you talk about this visit to the US. He's going to Washington for a state dinner at the White House. We were just talking before with Bronwyn Bishop and Jason Morrison about whether or not the Prime Minister should make a visit to Tel Aviv as well. Rishi Sunak's just landed there today. Joe Biden landed there yesterday. Ought we send a representative?
Look, I'm not so sure about that. There's obviously people with a lot more intelligence about these matters than me, but I was a little concerned about the President Biden travelling there this week into a conflict zone, and it hasn't probably gone. It definitely didn't go to plan, let's say, given the fallout from the hospital tragedy and the subsequent cancellation of meetings with Jordan with Arab nations. I think this has to be handled very, very carefully, and as I say, everything that should be done in a way to seek to not further inflame tensions here. I'm not so sure what a visit from the Australian Prime Minister would achieve. I certainly don't think we should be seeking to go there because somehow we want to make this about us. It's not about us. It's not about Australia. It's about the region now, the Middle East region, resolving these differences, responding to these barbaric attacks in the most precise way as possible, so that we don't see an inflammation of tensions and we don't see a wider conflict. I mean, I think there's time for some people to be very frank. I mean, the thing that keeps me up the wake even more than energy prices now, Caleb, is another world war. I fear that there's just been this drumbeat these last couple of years, and I hope that in 10 years' time or so we don't look at these last 2 years as the Spanish Civil War period of the leading up to the World War. So that's
I'm
what
sorry,
we
Matt,
should be focused on.
we've run out of time, but I totally agree with you. We don't want to see that. Thank you for joining me, mate. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Up next is Peter Credlin.